Elias Santoro had a rule about water. No wine at business tables, no whiskey with partners, nothing that could cloud a decision. For 2 years he'd taken the same thing at every meeting. A glass of ice water, poured at the table, nothing more. Everybody in Chicago knew it. At 34, he ran the southern shipping yards from behind a face that never moved, a scar splitting his left brow, a gray suit, and a voice so quiet that grown men leaned in to catch it. That Thursday afternoon, in the private dining room at the Arden, the chandeliers were burning gold and the piano was playing something soft, and he lifted the glass toward his mouth the way he'd done 1,000 times. Then a woman came up behind his right shoulder. 28. Brown blonde hair pulled into a low knot, navy uniform with white piping, flat shoes worn down at the heel. She'd carried his coffee into his office every morning for a year, and he'd never once asked her name. She leaned in and laid one hand lightly on his sleeve, the way a secretary does when she's straightening a napkin, and she spoke 7 words against his ear. "Don't drink it. There's something in your glass." Then she stood up and walked on, smooth as anything, like she hadn't stopped at all. The glass froze an inch from his lips. Nobody in that room noticed. The partners kept laughing. The waiters kept moving. The piano kept going. Only one man at that table understood that that single inch was the distance between him and the rest of his life. And only one woman in that room knew what she'd just cost herself to close it. If a story about courage, sacrifice, and second chances means something to you, take a second to hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because there's a new story here for you every week. Now let's go back to that dining room, to a glass that never touched his lips, and to the 7 words that changed everything. He didn't knock over the glass of water. That was the first thing he decided, in the space of a single breath. A man who slapped a glass of water onto the carpet in the middle of a luncheon was a man who had just announced to the entire room that he knew. He set the glass back on the table, gently, in exactly the same place, turning it to the same angle it had been before, then pulled the file toward him as though the thought of taking a drink had never crossed his mind. The man seated across from him was halfway through a sentence about extending the operating rights to Pier 9, and Elias nodded at the right moments, asked the right question in the right place, and wrote a single letter in the margin of the page that even he wouldn't be able to read later. Inside, he was running 2 theories side by side, like 2 sets of railroad tracks laid next to each other, without yet knowing which one led to the edge of a cliff. The first theory was that the woman had just saved his life. The second was that she was part of the trap, planted there to make him panic, rise from his chair, cause a scene, and turn an ordinary luncheon with his own hands into proof that he was no longer stable enough to run anything at all. He had lived long enough in his world to know that a warning delivered at the right moment could sometimes cost more than a bullet. No one needed to poison a man if they could make him jump out of his own chair, so he stayed seated. He smiled when he was supposed to smile, slid the contract toward the man beside him for an initial, and didn't look toward the door of the room even once. When the luncheon finally broke up, he was the last to stand. He fastened his suit jacket again, walked past the table like a man satisfied with the day's business, and only when he reached the hallway did he quietly say one sentence to Rocco Belandi, that the glass on his table wasn't to leave the building in anyone else's hands. Rocco turned back immediately. He came out again a short while later, carrying the glass wrapped in a white napkin, his face expressionless, and said they had already cleared nearly the entire table, and that the water pitcher and several of the other glasses had been taken down to the kitchen and washed before he got there. Elias only nodded. The one thing he needed to preserve, he had preserved. In the car, he sat in silence staring through the window, and for the first time that afternoon he allowed himself to think about what was truly under threat. For the past 2 years, his name had sat inside a federal investigation file thick enough to be divided into multiple volumes. He was out on bail, but that freedom hung by a thread so thin it was almost absurd. At any moment, the court could summon him for a sample, without warning and without explanation. One positive result would be enough. No trial, no argument, no witness required. Just one stamped sheet of paper, and he would be back behind a locked door, while everything he had spent 2 years dismantling would fall straight back into the hands of the people who wanted it there. His sample collection had been scheduled for that afternoon. The appointment had been sitting on his desk since morning, and he had read it while taking his first sip of coffee that day without giving it a second thought. Now, sitting in the car with the napkin-wrapped glass resting on Rocco's lap, he saw that appointment in an entirely different light. No one chose a day at random. No one chose a glass at random. And no one in this city was stupid enough to think about killing him. Because the entire city knew about what he had left with a law office in Boston, a sealed set of files sitting quietly in a safe that would automatically go where it needed to go if he died, disappeared, or simply failed to confirm that he was still alive within a predetermined period of time. Killing him would bring everyone down with him, but destroying his credibility wouldn't. Turning him into an addict who had violated the conditions of his bail wouldn't make anyone responsible for anything. People would shake their heads and say that Santoro blood was still Santoro blood in the end, and then they would divide the peers among themselves in silence. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and realized something that made him colder than everything else he had just considered. He didn't know who she was. He had sat in that room for more than 2 hours. He had studied every face around the table. He even remembered the names of 3 of their wives. And yet the woman who had just leaned close to his ear, the woman who had placed her entire life into those 7 words, was someone he couldn't even name. All he remembered was a very quiet voice, and a hand resting against the sleeve of his jacket so lightly that it had almost seemed unreal. The room on the upper floor of the Ashland warehouse had no windows, only a single light bulb hanging low over a long oak table darkened by years of human hands. And the 7 men seated around it were all older than Elias, every one of them having sat in that very room when his father still presided over the table. He arrived 15 minutes late, something he had never done before, and no one asked why. He hung his coat over the back of his chair, sat down, rested his hands on the tabletop, then said aloud what he had been considering all winter. Beginning at the end of that month, every undocumented stream of money would be cut out of the port system. No more undeclared containers, no more cold storage rented on nothing more than a spoken agreement, no more charges called arrangement fees that no one had ever entered into any ledger. Anyone who wanted to continue doing business with the Santoro docks would do it through contracts, pay taxes, and submit to audits. When he finished, he fell silent and offered no further explanation. The silence lasted long enough for them to hear the heater trembling inside the wall. Then Tobias Halloran, the oldest man in the room, the man who had once held Elias in his arms before Elias had even learned to walk, brought his palm down against the wood. He didn't shout. He struck the table only once, hard and dry, then said that Elias's father had built every foot of those docks with the very things Elias was now calling dirty, that Salvatore Santoro would never have sat in this room and listened while his son took apart an entire life's work one bolt at a time, and that if he were still alive, the conversation in this room would be very different. Several men nodded. Another said quietly that the docks didn't belong to any one man, that there were children to think about, families who had lived from those docks for more years than anyone cared to count. Elias didn't rise. He didn't raise his voice, didn't extend a hand, didn't shift his chair. He let them finish speaking, waited one more beat after the last man had fallen silent, then answered in a voice so quiet that all 7 of them had to lean slightly forward to hear him. He said his father had died in a room without windows, a room very much like this one, and that on the day of the funeral, rain had fallen from morning until evening. He said he remembered who came. He remembered who stood in the rain without an umbrella. He remembered who sent flowers but didn't attend. He remembered who had called 3 days earlier to ask how things were and then hung up. And he remembered who hadn't called at all. He spoke 4 names, slowly and clearly, without a single adjective, without one accusation, just 4 names spoken aloud in a room containing 7 men. Then he stopped. He didn't say what he remembered them for. He didn't say what he intended to do with that memory. Tobias Halloran slowly withdrew his hand from the tabletop and lowered it into his lap. No one answered. No one looked toward the man beside him. The silence became so thick that it turned into an answer of its own, and Elias knew he had won this round without needing to say another word. He also knew the price for it would be collected on some day that hadn't arrived yet. At the far end of the table, close to the wall, Cormac sat motionless. His younger brother had arrived before everyone else that day and chosen the seat where the light reached least, and throughout the entire meeting, he hadn't said a word. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't strike the table with anyone else, and didn't look toward Elias when he spoke those 4 names. He only turned the paper cup slowly and steadily between his hands, and at one point Elias saw him glance down at his phone before placing it face down on the table, the glass pressed against the wood. Elias registered it, the way a man registers some faint sound in the middle of the night and then goes back to sleep. When the meeting ended, the 7 men left one by one. Every one of them shook Elias's hand. Every one of them called him by the same name they had once used for his father, and not one hand tightened more than necessary. Cormac was the last to leave. He walked past Elias, paused for half a second as though he meant to say something, then merely gave his arm a light pat and headed down the stairs. Outside, darkness had already fallen. Rocco opened the car door and waited until Elias was seated before saying that from this day forward he should change his route every day, never travel the same road twice, and never eat anywhere that had been reserved more than half a day in advance. Elias looked through the window and said he still had to get to the sample collection appointment before 6 o'clock. That same afternoon, while Elias Santoro sat in the car staring through the window, Adeline Kavanagh stood behind the service counter at the Arden Hotel and tried to keep both of her hands still. She dropped a spoon onto a tray, and the sound of metal striking metal seemed so loud that she thought the entire lobby would turn to look. No one did. No one there had ever truly looked at her. Her life, if anyone had asked, could have been told in the time it took to wait for an elevator. Her mother died one October afternoon on a stretch of road less than a mile from home, struck by a car that fled the scene, and they found the car but never found justice. Her father, a lifelong dock worker, who had never known how to write a legal complaint, worked 3 shifts back-to-back through the years that followed, paid off every medical bill, paid every funeral expense, then one morning collapsed in the middle of his second shift and never woke again. Adeline left college during her final year. She raised her younger sister Nell, a 7-year-old girl with a heart that needed surgery and an imagination larger than the apartment the two sisters lived in. She had once worked 3 jobs at the same time, had slept in her car through 2 winters, had submitted applications to places that couldn't even be bothered to answer. The only place that hired her was the Santoro office, and she had never asked where the money there came from, nor had she ever taken home a single dollar that wasn't hers. 40 minutes before the luncheon, she was sent down to the storage room at the end of the ground floor hallway to retrieve a stack of backup menus. The storage room was divided in 2 by a thin partition, with linens kept on the other side, and she had been standing there, one hand pulling the stack of paper from a shelf, when she heard people enter beyond the wall. The first voice belonged to Marguerite Doyle, the woman who kept every ledger for the port system, a voice that was always fast and clipped, as though she were calculating even while she spoke. She asked about the glass. She asked who would pour it and when. She said he always drank plain water, always, never anything else, and that it was the only thing anyone could be certain of about that man. Then the second voice answered. A man's voice, slow, smooth, warm, the kind of voice trained to make people feel safe, the voice of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms with high ceilings, where everyone else had to sit still and listen. He said there was a sample collection scheduled that afternoon, that it only had to happen once, and that after that no one would have to do anything else, because the law would take care of the rest on its own. He said it as casually as though he were discussing the weekend weather. Adeline stood frozen between the 2 shelves, the stack of menus pressed against her chest, and for one moment she didn't understand why her entire body had gone cold before her mind had even caught up with what she was hearing. Then she understood, not because of what he had said, because of the way he had said it. She had heard that voice once before in her life, in the stone corridor of the county courthouse, on the day they ruled there wasn't enough evidence. She was 23 then, standing beside her father, when a silver-haired man, with carefully combed hair, approached them, came close enough that she could smell the cologne on his collar, and told her father that sometimes the best way to respect the dead was to let them rest, and that he had an offer that might help the family move forward. He had said that sentence with the same gentleness, with the same warmth. Her father had answered him with a single sentence, then taken Adeline by the arm and led her away. So many years had passed that Adeline had forgotten the man's face, had even forgotten the color of the clothes he wore, but she had never forgotten his voice. Now it was on the other side of a partition less than 2 steps away from her, and it was discussing a glass of water. She remained still until both of them left. She stayed there for a long time afterward, too, still holding the stack of menus against her chest, still hearing the air conditioning humming overhead, with only one thought repeating again and again inside her mind, that she wasn't supposed to know this. That people who learned things like this usually didn't remain around for long. She set the stack of menus down at the shift handoff desk and went straight into the employee changing room, where more than a dozen blue metal lockers stood beside a bench with one leg already coming loose. She sat down, opened her locker, and looked at the inside of the door, where a photograph taken on a phone had been taped up, printed at one of those self-service kiosks in a supermarket, its colors slightly off. In the picture, Nell was laughing with her 2 front teeth missing, holding an ice cream cone that had melted all the way down to her wrist. Adeline looked at that photograph every day, twice a day, and she had always thought she looked at it to remind herself what she was working for. That afternoon, she realized she was looking at it to ask permission. In the pocket of her uniform was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, one she had read so many times that she knew every word by heart. A letter from the hospital confirming that Nell's surgery had been scheduled, that the entire cost would be covered by an assistance fund, and that the family wouldn't be required to pay anything in advance. She took it out, unfolded it, and this time she didn't read the notice. She read the final line, the smallest print on the page, where the name of the person who had approved it was listed. She had seen that name dozens of times without ever paying attention to it. The way people glance at the name of an agency printed on an envelope. Now, she looked at it and heard a voice. Warm, slow, smooth as velvet. The same man. The same voice that had discussed the glass of water behind the partition less than an hour ago. And the same voice that had stood beside her father in the courthouse corridor all those years before. Adeline sat there for a very long time with the paper in her hands. She understood clearly, so clearly that she didn't need another second to think about it. That if she opened her mouth, this chain would break at its very first link, and that first link was her little sister's heart. No one needed to fire her. All it would take was one phone call, one note saying the case was under internal review, and the name Nell Kavanaugh would slip from the list as quietly as a leaf falling from a branch. No one would have to take responsibility. No one would have to explain anything to anyone. She thought about leaving it alone, thought about walking back out there, pouring more water, clearing more tables, and going home. The man sitting in the middle of that dining room wasn't a good man. The whole city knew that, and no one in this world had the right to demand that she risk her life for someone like him. She could live with that. Plenty of people lived with things heavier than that, and then she remembered her father. Not his face, but one winter evening after he came home from work, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking off his shoes, when he told her something she hadn't fully understood at the time. He said there were 2 kinds of silence in this world. The first was silence born from fear, and everyone had the right to be afraid. Fear didn't make anyone a worse person. The second was silence bought with money, and that kind was different, because after the first time, a person would no longer know who they were. He had said it with his calloused hands resting on his knees, and she remembered that he hadn't looked at her while he spoke. Adeline folded the paper again, carefully, along the same old creases, and slipped it back into her pocket. She stood, closed the locker, and looked at Nell's photograph one last time before the metal door shut. She smoothed the front of her uniform. She didn't cry. She only felt that her hands were cold, and that her heart was beating with a strange slowness, slower than usual, as though her body already knew what was coming, and was quietly putting itself in order. Then she walked back outside. She moved past 2 rows of tables with a tray in her hands, no faster and no slower than she normally did, and by then there was only one thought left in her mind, that she would finish saying it before she had time to change her mind. She had arranged those 7 words while she was still standing in the changing room, as short as she could make them, without one unnecessary sound, because she understood that she had exactly the length of time it took to straighten a napkin. And when she stood upright and continued walking, the only thing she felt wasn't fear, but a terrifying weightlessness, the feeling of someone who had just released her grip on something she had clung to for far too long, and now had nothing left to do but wait and see where she would fall. The Judicial Supervision Center occupied the 3rd floor of a gray building on Van Buren Street, and Elias arrived before his appointment time, exactly as he always did. On the way up, Rocco reminded him that his lawyer could still request a postponement on medical grounds. Elias didn't answer right away. He only said that failing to appear was a violation, that refusing to provide a sample was also a violation, and that both would be entered into his record more heavily than even a positive result, because a positive result still left room for argument, while not showing up required nothing more than a single line of writing to settle everything. He said it in the voice of a man reading a train schedule. That was the beauty of the trap. It left no way out. No one shoved him into the water. They simply stood there and watched him step into it himself, because there was nowhere else left for him to put his foot. The 3rd floor hallway was covered in gray vinyl flooring, with a row of plastic chairs along the wall, and a vending machine that had been empty for a long time. Elias sat down, rested both hands on his knees, and waited. He didn't think about the glass of water. He thought about the white napkin wrapped around it in Rocco's car, and about the fact that he had checked the only thing that could be checked. There was a very thin kind of reassurance in that thought, so thin that later he would remember it and think himself foolish. Then the elevator doors opened, and Gideon Falcone stepped out. He wore a charcoal wool coat and carried a slim leather briefcase in one hand, his silver hair combed smoothly back, and he smiled the moment he saw Elias, the kind of smile worn by a man who had just found what he was looking for. He said he had just finished some business at the courthouse on the second floor and thought he should stop by, that moments like this weren't the kind a man ought to sit through alone. He lowered himself into the chair beside Elias, rested the briefcase on his lap, then lifted one hand and placed it on Elias's shoulder, leaving it there longer than an ordinary reassuring pat. He said Elias's father would have been proud of the way he endured things like this, that he had always said Elias was stubborn but knew when to choose his moments for stubbornness. Then he called him son. He had called Elias that since Elias wasn't yet tall enough to reach his shoulder, and for more than 20 years, it had always been the most comforting sound Elias could hear on a bad day. Elias nodded and said thank you. He didn't say anything else. He didn't ask why a lawyer, who supposedly had business in the courthouse on the second floor, knew the exact time of his sample appointment on the third. When his name was called, Elias stood, took off his coat, and handed it to Rocco, then walked into the room at the end of the hallway. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. The young technician put on gloves, labeled the sample, recorded the time, had Elias sign in 2 places, and told him in the flat, practiced voice of someone who repeated the same sentence all day long, that the on-site screening result was only preliminary, carried no legal weight, and that the sample would be sent to a laboratory designated by the court for confirmatory testing. Elias asked how long. The technician said 3 days. He signed his name, thanked him, and stepped back into the hallway. Gideon was gone. The chair beside the one where Elias had been sitting still held a trace of warmth. That night, in the office above the warehouse, Rocco set a laptop on the desk and opened security footage from the third-floor hallway that an acquaintance of his had managed to obtain. They replayed the same brief section again and again. In the frame where Elias rose and walked into the room, Gideon remained seated, one hand resting on his briefcase, his eyes following him. Then the door closed behind Elias, and in a moment, shorter than a blink, before Gideon had time to stand and fasten his coat again, his face changed. It didn't tighten. He didn't smile. Everything in his face simply dropped away at once, like a curtain slipping from its rod, revealing beneath it a calm emptiness so complete that Rocco had to replay the footage a 4th time before he was willing to believe he wasn't imagining it. Elias watched it a 5th time, then told Rocco to close the laptop. He sat motionless in the darkness for a long while, listening to trucks moving along Ashland Street outside. The clock had begun to run. 3 days remained. Near midnight, Rocco came back with a thin file tucked beneath his arm and placed it in front of Elias without saying a word. He simply pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, rested both hands on the table, and waited. Elias opened it. The first page was a copy of a handwritten job application, the handwriting slanted and even, the pen strokes pressing slightly harder at each new line. Adeline Kavanaugh, born in Bridgeport. Permanent address at a place he knew was an old apartment complex behind Halsted Street. Education. Final year of accounting left unfinished. No degree. Experience. Server, warehouse worker, overnight, gas station attendant. References. None. The section reserved for interview notes had been left completely blank. Elias turned to the next page and found the first thing that made him stop. In the lower right corner of the intake form, in the space reserved for the approval signature, there wasn't the signature of the head of human resources. It was another signature, one so familiar that he recognized it before he even read the name. Beneath it was a short, courteous note, in blue ink, requesting that the applicant be placed in an office secretary position and that her file be given priority. Rocco said quietly that he had checked with human resources. They remembered it clearly because it had been unusual. That application hadn't gone through any of the normal rounds. It had come down from above, with a phone call attached, and the girl had started work the following week. Elias kept turning the pages. Behind the personnel file were several other sheets, printed on completely different paper from the county court's administrative archive system, and he knew immediately that Rocco must have paid some kind of price to obtain them. It was an index of petitions filed in a closed case. A fatal traffic accident on Archer Street. The victim, a woman named Kavanaugh. Petition for reconsideration. Petition for a copy of the scene report. Petition for access to traffic camera data. Complaint regarding failure to respond. Petition for reconsideration. Second request. Petition for reconsideration. Third request. The same petitioner's name appeared again and again, year after year, spring and then autumn, patient and steady as someone knocking on a door that had been welded shut. The final page bore a filing date from more than a year earlier. After that, there was nothing. Elias stared for a long time at the blank space beneath the final entry. Then he went back to the intake form and compared the dates. The last petition filed with the court, then the job application, less than 3 weeks apart. He lowered the papers onto the table. Outside, a truck turned into the lot, its air brakes giving a brief hiss before falling silent. Rocco said nothing. He had understood before he ever came up the stairs, and he was wise enough not to put anyone else's realization into words for them. Elias sat motionless in the darkness, only the desk lamp casting light across half his face, and he let the thought travel through its entire course, slowly, one link at a time, the way someone follows a thread to discover where it has been tied. No one had threatened her. No one had gone to her home in the middle of the night. No one had smashed a window. No one had said a single thing she could reasonably take to anyone and report. They had done something far smarter and far crueler. They had given her a job at exactly the moment no one else would hire her. They had paid the medical bills for her 7-year-old sister at exactly the moment she had no idea where else to find the money, and they had placed all of it into her hands without asking for anything in return, because they didn't need to ask. A person who owed a debt understood on their own that they were supposed to stay quiet. A person with a little sister waiting for surgery understood on their own what it might cost to make trouble for someone. They hadn't bought her silence. They had simply given her enough reasons to choose silence for herself, day after day, while believing it was the best luck life had ever given her. For more than a year, she had walked past the door to his office every day with a cup of coffee in her hand, and every day she had been kept within sight of the man who had left her mother lying on Archer Street, without anyone ever having to answer a single question about it. Elias reached over and switched off the desk lamp. In the darkness, he told Rocco, his voice quieter than usual, that he wanted to see her tomorrow. 2.5 days remained. The next morning, she was called up to his office, and she went upstairs carrying a cup of coffee, because it was the only thing she could think of that would give her hands something to do. He was standing with his back to the door, looking down at the container yard through the large window. He told her to close the door. She set the coffee on the edge of his desk and waited. He didn't thank her. Not a word. He turned, looked at her, then asked directly why she had done it. Adeline meant to answer with the sentence she had prepared all night. Something about doing what was right. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was something entirely different. She said that once in her life she had stood and watched someone die while no one spoke up, and that she had lived with that long enough to know she didn't want to live through it a second time. He didn't ask who that person was. She was grateful to him for that, and immediately frightened, because she understood that his not asking meant he already knew. He was silent for a moment, then asked her name. She told him. He repeated it, first and last, slowly, once, the way someone places something in a part of the mind where it won't be lost later. Then he pointed to the chair in front of the desk and told her to sit down. An open file lay on the desk, and she recognized it immediately, because she had arranged dozens of similar files herself. A summary sent over by the law office, the kind of document a secretary was allowed to carry into the room but wasn't allowed to read. Last night, she had read it. She had sat at the outer desk, with one hand resting on the file, and told herself she would only glance through it so she would know who she was risking her life for. 3 pages. Not long. There were company names, sums of money with no identifiable source, names of people accompanied by very short notes stating when they had stopped cooperating and why. One line mentioned a warehouse on the west side and what had passed through it over the course of many years. She read all 3 pages in the time it took to hear the wall clock ticking, and when she folded them closed again, her hands were so cold that she had to press them around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Now she sat across from him, and he looked at the file, then at her, and he knew. She started to say something. He raised one hand to stop her, very gently. He said he wasn't going to explain. He said that if she was waiting to hear him claim that everything in those pages had been fabricated, or belonged to someone else, or happened during his father's time and not his own, then she would be waiting a very long time. He said there wasn't a single line in those pages that was false. Then he added one more sentence in a voice so quiet that she had to lean slightly forward to hear him, that she should be afraid of him, that she was right to be afraid, and that anyone sitting inside this building who wasn't afraid of him was either a fool or someone planning something. Adeline didn't answer. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. He continued, and this time there was something different in his voice, something drier, almost irritated. He told her to submit her resignation that very day, citing family reasons, with no notice required. He said someone would take care of her wages and everything else. He said she should take her sister out of Chicago, anywhere at all, as far away as possible, and leave no forwarding address. He said what she had done the afternoon before carried a price she couldn't yet imagine, and that the only way to avoid paying it was to disappear before anyone thought to come looking for her. She sat quietly and listened until he had finished. Then she shook her head. She said her sister's name was on a list at a hospital in this city, that after all those years of waiting, that name was finally there, and she wasn't going to leave and let it fall off the list. She said she had nowhere to go, no one to go to, and that people could only run when there was still somewhere ahead of them to run toward. She said it in an ordinary voice, without trembling, and it was that very ordinariness that made the words heavier than anything else. Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he gave a very slight nod and told her to go back outside and work as she did every other day. By noon that day, Adeline understood that the circle had begun to close around her, and it was closing through things so small that no one could have given them a name. First came the shift schedule posted outside the Human Resources office, where her name had been moved from the morning shift to the late afternoon shift, without notice and without anyone asking her. Then came her access card. Marguerite Doyle personally came down to the first floor, stood at the reception desk with the expression of someone handling a dull administrative matter, and said that the finance department was reviewing all access privileges to the office area after the audit, that Adeline's card was on the list to be collected and reissued, and that the process would only take a few days. Adeline handed over the card. Marguerite took it, thanked her, and walked away. That was all. Not one threat, not one look held longer than normal. And it was precisely because of that Adeline remained standing there long after the woman had disappeared at the end of the hallway, empty-handed, feeling as though someone had peeled away a layer of her skin without drawing a drop of blood. There was one thing Marguerite hadn't considered. Years earlier, when Adeline had still been assigned to bookkeeping support, before the company separated the finance department from the port office, she had been given a login code for the internal accounting system. That code wasn't connected to her access card, wasn't connected to any door, and couldn't be used from any computer outside the Pier 9 office, where the system still ran on an old private network no one had gotten around to replacing. It belonged on the list of things that should have been retired years ago, along with several dot matrix printers and an old notebook filled with landline numbers. No one thought about it, because no one imagined there would ever come a day when she would dare go back there. That afternoon, Elias went to Marguerite Doyle's office. He didn't knock. He walked in, closed the door behind him, and she looked up from her screen wearing a smile that had clearly been prepared in advance. He didn't sit down. From inside his coat, he took out a blank sheet of ordinary printer paper, unlined and without a heading, and placed it on the desk in front of her. Then he set a pen beside it. He told her she had a few days. He said that during that time, she could write one name on that sheet of paper, the name of the person who had paid her, fold it, and leave it somewhere he would find it. Or she could write nothing at all. He said either choice was acceptable, because he already had the name. He said it no louder than he would have spoken while ordering lunch. Marguerite opened her mouth to speak. He raised one hand, and she fell silent. He said he hadn't come there to ask her anything, that he didn't need a confession, didn't need an apology, and didn't care how she intended to explain herself. He said there was only one thing he wanted to know, what kind of person she was, and that sheet of paper would answer the question for her. Then he turned and left, opening the door and closing it behind him with the same quiet precision with which he had entered. She remained alone in the room with the soft hum of the computer filling the silence, staring at the blank sheet of paper in the middle of the desk without reaching out to touch it. Late that evening, Elias met Nadine Whitlock at a Greek restaurant in Greektown, at the last table beside the kitchen, where the clatter of pans drowned out everything else. She didn't order anything. She listened until he had finished speaking, stirred her glass of water with a paper straw, then answered him plainly. She said his cooperation agreement with the district attorney's office rested on one condition, and one condition only: that he didn't violate any term of his bail until the case was complete. She said that if the confirmatory test came back positive, everything ended that same day. Not ended in the sense that he would have to explain himself. Ended in the sense that the agreement would cease to exist. The case would move toward prosecution, and everything he had turned over during the past 2 years would become the testimony of a defendant instead of the testimony of a cooperating witness. Elias asked whether there was any way to prove he had been poisoned. Whitlock looked at him for a moment, then said there was, if he could give her the person who arranged it, and the physical evidence. Then she added that he had 2 days left. The basement archive was beneath the office building, an entire city away from the storage room at the hotel, and she didn't go down there to overhear anyone. She went down to get papers. The late afternoon shift ended at 10 o'clock, and she had calculated that if she took the stairs instead of the elevator, no camera would record her, because the camera on the first-floor landing had been broken since summer, and no one had bothered to replace it. The basement key hung on a wooden board behind the reception desk, beside the electrical room key and the toilet paper storage key. In the place where people kept things no one considered important. Down below, there were only intermittent fluorescent lights, the smell of damp cardboard, and more than a dozen rows of metal shelving taller than a person, packed with file boxes closed and labeled by year. She found the payment records section, pulled out the boxes marked with the period she needed, and began photographing each sheet one by one with her father's old phone. It was a device that had been obsolete for years. Its screen scratched. One corner of the back casing held together with clear tape, and she kept it because it was the only thing she had left that still seemed to carry the touch of his hands. Before she began, she opened the voice recorder, propped the phone at an angle against the side of a box, then turned the pages while quietly reading aloud the voucher numbers, dates, and names of the entities receiving payment. If something happened to her, at least a voice would remain. She had made it through about half a box when she heard the basement door open. It wasn't the sound of someone pushing through in a hurry. It was the slow, measured opening of someone who knew he had all the time in the world. Adeline switched off the screen, crouched low between 2 shelves, and pulled a file box in front of her. The sound of shoes against concrete came clearly, one step at a time, turned into the aisle, then stopped, directly on the other side of the shelving, exactly 1 sheet of metal and several rows of cardboard boxes away from her. She heard him breathe out, the breath of someone who had just finished coming down a flight of stairs, and she recognized it as precisely as she had recognized that voice. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there, and she heard his fingers moving slowly along the spines of the file boxes, one after another, searching for a label. In the darkness beneath her chest, the phone suddenly lit up. A white notification box appeared in the middle of the screen, bright enough to cast light against the inside of her sleeve, warning that the battery had 3% remaining. Adeline pressed it against the front of her blouse, held it there tightly with both hands, and didn't dare breathe. The light still leaked out along the edges, faint and blue, enough to cast the shadows of her fingers onto the side of the box. The fingers on the other side stopped moving. She heard paper rustle. Then a file was pulled from the shelf directly above her head, and the entire row of boxes shifted slightly. Dust fell into her hair. He remained there for one more beat, very brief, the kind of moment she would think about many times afterward, and never be certain what it had meant. Then the footsteps turned away, slow, even, growing more distant. The basement door closed. Adeline stayed seated on the floor until both calves had gone numb. When she was finally able to stand and wipe the back of her hand across her mouth, there was blood on it. She had bitten her lip without realizing it. She photographed the remaining pages with the last of the battery, returned the box to exactly the same place, with the label facing the same direction, then climbed out of the basement by the stairs and stepped through the back door. Outside, the air was cold and damp. A figure stood beneath a lamp at the corner of the parking lot, both hands shoved into his coat pockets, stamping his feet again and again. And when she came closer, she recognized Teddy Nunn, the trainee server at the Arden, the boy who wasn't yet 22 and was always dropping trays. He said he had been waiting there since it was still light outside. He said he hadn't dared call. Then he pulled something wrapped in a paper napkin from inside his coat pocket, placed it in her hand, and his hand was trembling so badly that the napkin came open before she could fully take hold of it. Inside was a small glass vial, empty, with a rubber stopper and no label. He said they had told him to throw it away as soon as the job was done. He said he had carried it all the way to the trash bin behind the kitchen, stood there for a long time, then became so frightened that he hid it inside his toolbox instead. He said his mother owed people money, and he didn't know what to do anymore. The next morning, she arrived at the hospital before visiting hours, and they let her in because the nurse on duty had known her face for a long time. Nell was sitting cross-legged on the bed, a box of colored pencils tipped sideways beside her, and the little girl looked up and cried out her sister's name before Adeline had even crossed the threshold. On the tray table stretched across the bed were several unfinished drawings, one of a ship, one of a tree, 3 times taller than the house beside it, and one sheet set apart from the others, face down, as though it had been carefully hidden away for something special. Nell told her to close her eyes. Adeline closed them. The little girl counted to 3, then told her to open them, and when Adeline did, the drawing was already in her hands. In the picture was a house with a red roof and a yellow door, with 2 girls standing in the front yard holding hands, one much taller with her hair tied low, the other smaller with 2 braids sticking straight up toward the sky. Above the roof was an orange sun, drawn right over the clouds, and in the upstairs window stood a woman with long hair, visible only from the shoulders up, both hands resting on the sill. Adeline stared at the picture for a long time, then asked who was in the window. Nell said it was Mom. The little girl explained very seriously, in the voice of someone who had thought the matter through carefully, that if she drew Mom standing outside in the yard, Mom would only be able to see one side, but if she stood high up at the window, she could see the whole house, the yard, the tree, both sisters, every single place without missing anything. Then Nell pointed to one corner of the drawing and told her sister to look. She had added a little stool beneath the window so Mom could stand on it without getting tired. Adeline said the picture was beautiful. She said she would tape it to the cabinet at home, right where it could be seen most easily, and asked whether Nell could draw another one for her to take to work. The little girl nodded eagerly, and immediately reached for the box of colored pencils. Adeline stayed a while longer, smoothing the loose strands of hair from her sister's forehead, listening as Nell told her which nurse knew how to fold paper cranes, and who had promised to bring her more colored paper. Then Adeline said she was going outside to get some water. She walked the length of the hallway, turned into the far end where a window overlooked the parking lot, and stood there. She didn't make a sound. She only stood with both hands gripping the windowsill while tears ran down her chin and fell onto the backs of her hands, wave after wave, until she had to bend forward and press her forehead against the cold glass just to breathe. Outside, the sky was gray, and a man was scraping snow from his car window with a piece of cardboard. Adeline wiped her face with her sleeve, then took her father's old phone from her pocket. She had fully charged it again the night before. She turned it on, not to look at the photographs of the payment records, but because her hands had done what they always did whenever she found herself somewhere no one could see her. She opened the voicemail folder. At the very top of the list, above everything else, was an 11-second recording saved from that October afternoon, sent to her father's phone and kept by him for the rest of his life. She pressed play. Her mother's voice came through, slightly distorted by the connection, a little hurried, the voice of someone speaking while walking. Her mother said she was on her way home, that she had stopped by the bakery, that she had bought the kind with cream in the middle that the little one liked, and that the 2 girls should remember to eat dinner first and not wait for her. Adeline listened that far, then pressed stop, exactly as she always did, at the 7th second, because everything after that was the part she had never been able to bear. The moment her mother's voice began to grow faint and then cut off in the middle, and through all those years, Adeline had never once listened all the way to the final second. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. She stood there a little longer until the redness left her eyes. Then she really did go get water, and returned to the hospital room carrying 2 cups in her hands. Nell was coloring a ship, and looked up proudly to announce that this time she had drawn the smokestack much bigger than the last one. Adeline sat down on the edge of the bed, praised the smokestack, and smiled. She stayed there until visiting hours were over. The analysis of the glass came back in the early afternoon, sent through an email address that carried no one's name, and Rocco printed it out and brought it upstairs. The report was only 1 page long. In the traces of liquid left at the bottom of the glass, and along its sides, was a synthetic compound listed as a controlled substance, colorless, odorless, completely soluble in water, and capable of remaining in the body long enough to appear in any test conducted that same day. Elias read the entire report, then read it a second time. more slowly. Rocco said that was enough, that with the small glass vial in Adeline's possession and this analysis, they now had the two things Whitlock needed. Elias lowered the sheet onto the desk and said nothing. Something was scratching lightly at the edge of his memory, the feeling of a man climbing stairs in the dark and missing a step before he could understand why. He closed his eyes and went back to that afternoon. He saw the long table again, saw the contract file, saw himself nodding at the proper moments while two theories ran side by side inside his head. He saw the glass again, saw himself set it down and turn the handle back to the exact angle it had been before. Then he saw something else. He saw the waiter circling the table with a glass pitcher containing slices of lemon, bending beside each person's shoulder and refilling the glasses that had gone low. He saw it happen more than once. The luncheon had lasted more than 2 hours, and throughout those 2 hours he had been there from the beginning, talking, listening, initialing documents, and he had been the only person at the table who didn't touch alcohol. He opened his eyes. Very quietly, he asked Rocco which glass they had preserved. Rocco hesitated for half a second, then said it was the untouched glass left on the table, the one Elias had set down and hadn't drunk from. Elias asked about the pitcher. Rocco fell silent. Then he said it had already been taken down to the kitchen and washed before he left the dining room, along with the used glasses, and that he himself had told Elias exactly that in the hallway that same afternoon. The room remained silent for a long time. Elias leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the desk, staring at some point on the wall. The trap hadn't been in the glass. The trap had been in the pitcher, and the glass had only been there to reassure him that he had finished checking. He had examined the only thing he could examine, carried it away, wrapped it in a white napkin, and for the past 2 days he had lived with a paper-thin sense of safety, built from his own caution. Those 7 words had stopped the final sip. They hadn't stopped the ones before it. That afternoon, he called Adeline upstairs. He told her everything, leaving out not a single detail, in the same voice he used when reading numbers to the accountants. She stood and listened until he was finished. Then she reached one hand toward the back of a chair for support and sank down where she stood, not into the chair but onto the floor beside its legs, both hands clutching her head. She didn't cry aloud. She only sat there shaking her head, over and over, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice broke in the middle of the sentence. She said she had calculated wrong. She said she had stood in the changing room and weighed everything, had even weighed her little sister's name on a hospital list, and in the end, all she had managed to stop was 1 sip of water. She said she had traded everything for something that hadn't saved anyone. Elias didn't help her up. He walked around the desk, pulled a second chair closer, and sat facing her, his elbows resting on his knees so that his eyes were level with hers. He told her not to look at him that way. He said that before she leaned down beside his ear, he had exactly 1 afternoon left, and that afternoon had already been arranged for him before he ever stepped into the building. He said that after her 7 words, he had been given 3 more days. Then he said, more quietly, that his father had died in a room without windows, and he hadn't been given even 1 day to prepare. 3 days, Elias said, was far more than that. The photographs she had taken in the basement gave her only half of what she needed. They showed voucher numbers, dates, and the names of the entities receiving the money, but they didn't show where those payments had passed through before reaching them, and that part existed only inside the internal accounting system, something that couldn't be accessed from any computer outside the port. Adeline reached Pier 9 at nearly 11 o'clock that night. She took the bus to the end of the line, then walked the remaining distance along the chain-link fence, entering through the West Workers' Gate, where the elderly guard merely glanced up before lowering his eyes to his newspaper again, because he had watched her pass through that gate for more than a year. The port accounting office was on the 2nd floor of a low building with a wooden door and vinyl flooring curling upward at the edges. She switched on a single desk lamp, sat down, and entered her old login code. The screen flickered once and opened. No one had ever thought to disable it, just as no one had ever thought to replace the dot matrix printers stacked in the corner. She plugged in the flash drive and began downloading the files. The progress bar moved so slowly that she could clearly hear the computer fan and water dripping somewhere above the ceiling. Then the entire port went dark. Not one light. Not one row. Everything at once. The high-intensity lamps over the yard, the hallway lights, the lights in the room next door, all collapsing into darkness with a low thud that seemed to travel through the walls. The screen in front of her went black with them. The progress bar disappeared. Adeline sat motionless in the darkness, one hand still resting on the keyboard, and the first thing she thought about wasn't the data. She thought about the main breaker for the port complex being inside the electrical room on the ground floor, and that whoever had shut it off had to be someone who knew where the key was kept. She pulled out the flash drive, slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, and crawled toward the window. Outside, beneath the last faint light reaching in from the street lamps beyond the fence, a car was parked in the open space in front of the building. Its nose pointed toward the gate, its engine still running, exhaust drifting into the cold air in a thin white ribbon. She knew that car. She had watched it parked in the reserved space outside the office building every morning for more than a year. The door didn't open. No one got out. The car remained there a little longer, its brake lights glowing red and then going dark, before it slowly rolled toward the gate, turned left, and disappeared. Adeline didn't wait. She went down the stairs with one hand gripping the railing, slipped out through the rear door, and stepped into the container yard. There wasn't a single trace of light left there. The great steel boxes were stacked 2 levels high, forming narrow parallel corridors, and in the darkness they looked like walls with no fronts. She had gone perhaps 10 steps when she heard footsteps. More than one person. She turned into the passage on her left, then into the one on her right, and the footsteps remained, sometimes behind her, sometimes seeming to circle ahead, echoing from the steel walls on both sides, until she could no longer tell where they were truly coming from. She began to run. She reached the end of one passage, when a hand seized her arm and yanked her sharply sideways into the empty space between 2 stacks of containers, and another hand covered her mouth before she could make a sound. She struggled once, then she smelled the damp wool of a heavy coat, and she recognized the man holding her. Elias said nothing. He simply remained where he was, his back pressed against the cold steel wall, while she stood hidden in the darkness between him and the side of the container, the space between them no wider than the thickness of a breath. The footsteps passed the mouth of the passage, slowed, stopped, then continued, gradually fading toward the docks. He waited a long time after there was nothing left to hear. Then he removed his hand and stepped back half a pace. Adeline drew in a long breath. She felt both knees trembling, and she hated it. She asked how he had known she was there. He said that earlier that afternoon he had told Rocco to keep watch on the system, and when someone used a login code that technically shouldn't have existed anymore, the system recorded it, and he had driven down from Ashland in far less time than safety should have allowed. He paused. Then he said quietly that during that entire drive, he hadn't been thinking about whether they would find her. What frightened him was that he might find her 3 seconds later than they did. The flash drive had downloaded a little less than half of the files before the power went out, but that incomplete half was enough to reveal something neither of them had been looking for. The next morning, in the office above the warehouse, Elias sat in front of the screen with Rocco and traced the old expenditures backward through time, beginning with the most recent years and moving further into the past. Most of it was familiar. Payments he already knew about, things he had personally cut away over the previous 2 years. Then, he stopped at an entry buried inside a category of off-the-books legal expenses. A single payment that never appeared again, recorded under 3 abbreviated letters the accountants of that time had used for things they didn't want to name. He opened the attached file. It was a scanned copy of an out-of-court settlement agreement. The plaintiffs were a family named Kavanaugh. The defendant was a man named Ambrose Falcone. The date fell in the winter after that October afternoon on Archer Street. Elias read every line slowly, and he knew what he was reading before he reached the end. On the final page, in the section reserved for the party guaranteeing payment, there was a signature, the handwriting slanted, the first S large and abruptly cut off, the same stroke he had seen on thousands of pieces of paper throughout his childhood, on school registration forms, hospital discharge papers, envelopes containing birthday money. Salvatore Santoro. He sat motionless for a very long time. Rocco stood behind him and said nothing. Then Elias began tracing everything backward, and the pieces came together with a speed that felt merciless. Ambrose Falcone was Gideon's only son. At the time, he had been 24 years old. The case had been opened. There had been a file. There had been an accident report. Then, within a few months, everything had gone quiet. Petitions unanswered. Requests for traffic camera data denied on technical grounds. And eventually the case had been closed for lack of sufficient evidence. No one was convicted. No one had to explain anything to anyone. And during that same period, his father had signed as guarantor for a settlement payment and made several calls to people only he could have called, doing it the way a man performed a favor for an old friend, for the man who had stood beside him through so many years and would later stand beside his son. Elias thought about the windowless room where his father had died. He thought about the chair he was sitting in, the oak table in the Ashland warehouse, the 7 old men seated around it, the entire port system carrying his name. He hadn't driven that car. He hadn't known anything about it when it happened. But the chair he occupied had been cushioned by an October afternoon on Archer Street, and he had been sitting in it all these years without ever knowing what lay beneath him. That afternoon, he called Adeline upstairs. He didn't prepare an opening sentence, didn't search for a gentler way to say it, didn't use the quiet voice he normally used when he wanted people to lean closer to hear him. He placed the printed pages on the desk, pushed them toward her, and told her everything. He told her the name of the man who had been driving the car. He told her whose son he was. He told her about the settlement, about the phone calls, about why for all those years every petition she had filed had fallen into a place with no bottom. Then he came to the signature on the final page, and he said his father's name in exactly the same voice he had used for everything that came before, without lowering it even slightly. He didn't say that he hadn't known. He didn't say that he had been young then. He didn't say a single thing to distance himself from that signature. Adeline listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt him once. She picked up the printout, read the final page, then placed it back on the desk neatly, the edge of the paper aligned with the edge of the table. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't throw anything. Didn't say a single word about her mother. Didn't ask him why. She simply sat still for the length of a few breaths, and during those breaths, Elias watched something drain slowly and cleanly from her face, like water receding from a stretch of sand. Then she stood. She pulled the chair back and pushed it neatly against the desk, the way she always did whenever she left a room. She picked up the coat draped over her arm. At the door, she paused for half a second without turning around, and Elias opened his mouth to say something he himself didn't know how to name. She didn't wait. She walked out and closed the door behind her, very gently, without a sound, and the silence she left in that room was heavier than anything she could have said. That night, Adeline didn't go home. She walked as far as the bus stop at the corner of Halsted Street, the one with a clear plastic shelter yellowed by age, and a metal bench cold enough to sting through her clothes, and she sat down there. The bus she needed passed 3 times. She watched it pull in, open its doors, wait, then close them, and move on, all 3 times. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Going home meant opening the door, turning on the light, seeing the drawing she had taped to the cabinet with the woman standing in the upstairs window, and she didn't have enough strength to stand in front of that picture tonight. She stayed there until the sky began to brighten, both hands buried in her coat pockets, her chin tucked into the collar, and through all those hours, she didn't cry once. That same night, on the upper floor of the Ashland warehouse, someone knocked on the door at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Cormac stood in the hallway with his coat unbuttoned and his hair stuck to his forehead, and he walked in without waiting to be invited. He placed a phone on the desk, not the phone Elias normally used. The second one, the phone Elias kept in the bottom left drawer, the one used to call exactly 1 number. Elias looked at it, then at his younger brother. Cormac said he had taken it in the fall. He said he hadn't meant to take it, that he had only been looking for a paperclip, and the phone had been there, and he had opened it because there was no password. He said the call history showed only 1 number, repeated again and again, once every week, always in the evening, and that he had searched the number online and found that it belonged to a government switchboard. He said he had sat in his car all night with the phone in his hand, unable to understand what he was holding. He said he had thought about asking his brother directly, and he hadn't done it. Then he said he had taken it to the only person he had trusted since their father died, the man who had driven him to his driver's test, the man who had signed papers for him when he got into trouble at 19. Cormac opened the phone, went into the messages, and pushed it toward Elias. There were several messages sent to Cormac's private phone, none of them long, separated by days. One told him to leave everything exactly as it was, and not tell anyone. Another asked whether his brother had gone anywhere that week outside his schedule. Another said some things were best left to the adults, that Cormac had done the right thing by coming to him, and that his father would surely have been proud. Elias read every message. For a very long time, he said nothing. Cormac began speaking faster, his voice breaking apart, saying that he hadn't known what anyone would do with the information, that he had only thought someone needed to stop Elias before he destroyed everything, that he had listened all winter to the old men saying his brother was selling away the family name. Then he dropped to his knees. He knelt right there in the middle of the office floor, both hands gripping the edge of the desk, and said that he had only wanted to preserve their father's name, that it was the only thing their father had left the two of them, and that he had nothing else to hold on to. Elias stood. He didn't help his brother up. He walked to the window, turned his back, and looked down at the dark container yard below. He remembered the room where his father had spent the final months of his life, the mezzanine level of another warehouse, walls painted cream, not a single window, with the lights kept on all day. He remembered the funeral, when it had rained from morning until evening, and he remembered Cormac still in his teens, standing beside him in the rain, holding his hand, without an umbrella. Elias turned around. He told his younger brother that he hadn't betrayed him. He said Cormac had only taken a question to the wrong person, and that was something that could happen to anyone in this family. Then he continued, more quietly, saying that their father's name wasn't something Cormac needed to preserve. He said that name was exactly what Elias was trying to bury. Bury completely, bury deep, so that when Cormac had children of his own someday, they wouldn't have to live in its shadow. He said their father had left them a name and a room without windows, and Elias had no intention of leaving either one to anyone else. Then he picked up the phone and told Cormac to stand up. By the time full daylight had come, Adeline rose from the metal bench at the bus stop, and she didn't go home. She walked to the public library on Halsted Street, sat down at a public computer in the corner of the room, and opened the flash drive. She didn't search for the settlement payment. She had read it on the printout Elias had pushed toward her the day before, and she didn't need to see it again. She searched for something else, the thing she had spent the entire night beneath that yellowed plastic shelter trying not to think about, the fund that was paying her little sister's medical bills. She followed the disbursement code, then traced the source account, then went backward again. The old accounting system had no real concealment function. It was simply too old for anyone to think about cleaning it up, and because of that, it kept everything the way a drawer kept whatever had been left inside when no one ever opened it. She worked backward through each layer, slowly, and at the final layer, the screen stopped on a line marked with 3 initials she had seen exactly once before in her life. On the printout Elias had pushed across the desk toward her yesterday. The same code, the same money. The settlement payment from all those years ago had never been paid out. It had been approved, guaranteed by signature, then left sitting in the fund, untouched, never withdrawn, never deleted, year after year, until at some point more than a year ago, someone opened it and transferred it into a new category labeled Medical Assistance for Employees' Relatives. The person who approved that transfer was the man with the voice as smooth as velvet. Adeline sat in front of the screen, and the cold began in her fingertips and worked its way inward, because she remembered why that money had never been paid. She had been there. She was 23 years old, standing in the stone corridor of the county courthouse, when the silver-haired man with the carefully combed hair handed her father a check, along with the suggestion that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to let them rest. Her father took the check. He looked at it for the length of a single breath. Then he placed it back into the other man's hand. He didn't throw it. He didn't tear it. He simply laid it in the man's palm and folded his fingers closed around it, and he said, "You can't buy my wife." He said those exact words once, then took Adeline by the hand and led her away, and she remembered the sound of his work boots striking the stone floor all the way down the corridor. After that, he worked 3 shifts. He paid every medical bill with his own back, paid every funeral expense with his own back, went 3 straight years without taking a single holiday off, and then one morning he collapsed in the middle of his second shift at the docks and never stood up again. Adeline sat motionless in the library, surrounded by the sound of turning pages and the cough of an old man at the next table, and she understood that for more than a year, every time she had held the hospital letter in her hands and felt the weight lift from her chest, every time she had looked at Nell's photograph inside her locker and told herself that at least this one thing was all right, she had been living on the exact money her father had died refusing to take. They hadn't been able to buy him, so they waited until he was dead, then brought that same money to his daughter, wrapped it in a different name, and placed it in her hands at the exact moment she was most exhausted. She bent forward, covered her face with both hands, and cried right there, without a sound, her shoulders shaking for so long that the person at the next table didn't even bother to look up. Then she wiped her face. That afternoon, she went to the hospital. Not to the inpatient floor, but to the financial office on the ground floor, asked for a set of forms, and sat in the row of chairs outside the hallway, filling in every line by hand. She wrote her sister's name in the beneficiary box. She wrote a request to terminate all current financial assistance and withdraw the application from the program. She signed it. She knew exactly what she had just done. She knew she didn't have that money, had no one she could ask for a loan, owned nothing she could offer as collateral, and knew that Nell Kavanaugh's name would be removed from the place it had finally reached the moment that form entered the system. She signed anyway, because her father had placed that check back into the other man's hand and walked out of the courthouse with both hands empty. And he had died before he could finish the rest of that story. Now she finished it for him. The woman at the financial services counter accepted the form, glanced over it, then looked up and asked Adeline if she was certain. Adeline said yes. The woman stamped it as received, wrote down the time, and explained in the voice of someone who had given the same explanation many times before that once a funding source was withdrawn, the file would be returned to unpaid status, and that if no other form of financial guarantee was submitted and entered into the system by the end of that business day, the scheduled surgery slot would be released back to the general list for another case. She said the financial office closed at 4 o'clock. She said it was now 3:20. Adeline stood there with the receipt in her hand, and for the first time in 2 days, she felt real panic. She went out into the hallway, leaned her back against the wall, and realized she had no one to call. She took out her phone, opened her contacts, and scrolled up and down a list so short it was almost painful to look at. Then she called. Rocco answered on the second ring. She didn't explain much. She only gave him the name of the hospital, the floor, and the closing time. He didn't ask a single question. He only said, "All right," and hung up. Elias was at the law office when Rocco called. He listened to everything, and the first thing he did wasn't write a check. He called his lawyer and asked one question: whether among the personal assets he had fully disclosed to the federal prosecutor's office, the assets already audited and verified and not involved in any dispute, there was anything that could serve as financial security for a medical case that same day. The lawyer was silent for several seconds, then said there was the house in Oak Park, the only thing left in Elias's name that wasn't tied to anything currently under review. Elias told him to prepare the documents immediately and bring them to the hospital. Rocco arrived first. He stood at the entrance to the ground floor financial office at 3:45, one hand holding the glass door open, and when the employee reminded him that they were about to close, he simply nodded very politely and said someone was on the way, and he would stand there. He didn't threaten anyone. He only stood there, large and silent, one hand resting on the doorframe, and that door couldn't close. Adeline came running down the administrative hallway from the far end, her flat shoes striking the tile, one arm clutching a bundle of papers, nearly colliding with a records cart twice. The lawyer arrived less than a minute after her, out of breath, his tie crooked to one side, and spread the documents across the counter. The employee looked them over, then raised her eyes and said the guarantor's signature had to be an original. Elias walked through the door at that exact moment. He didn't say a word to anyone. He went to the counter, took the lawyer's pen, and signed in the 3 places indicated. The employee entered the information into the computer, waited, then the printer produced a confirmation sheet. She wrote the time on it, 3:57. Adeline stood gripping the edge of the counter, and it took her a moment to remember how to breathe normally. When the two of them reached the hallway, she turned to him and said she would pay him back. She said she didn't know how long it would take, but she would repay every bit of it. Elias shook his head. He said there was nothing to repay. He said he hadn't given her a single dollar. He said the house in Oak Park still belonged to him, the documents still carried his name, and all he had done was place his name in an empty box on a form, so that her sister's name could remain exactly where it already was. Adeline told him that it was still the same thing. Elias stopped in the middle of the hallway and turned to look at her. Then he said quietly that no, it wasn't the same thing. He said that if he had written a check and paid the money, she would owe him. And from that second forward, everything she did for him, every word she said to him, she would ask herself why she was doing it. He said he had spent his entire life in a world where people bound one another with favors, and he knew exactly how quickly that kind of debt ate away at a person. Then he said he didn't want her to owe him. He said it, then turned and walked away first, leaving her standing alone in the hospital hallway with the confirmation sheet in her hand. The invitation stated that an extraordinary shareholders meeting would be held at Emberley Hall on Monday afternoon, with the proposed transfer of operational control over the port system as its agenda, and throughout that entire weekend, the whole city talked about it in exactly the way Elias wanted people to talk. The 7 old men arrived early. Marguerite Doyle arrived precisely on time and sat in the second row, her hands resting on a closed leather briefcase. Gideon Falcone came last, shaking hands with each person as he entered, pausing beside Elias to squeeze his shoulder once, exactly as he had done for more than 20 years. Then the doors closed. Rocco stood guard on the inside, his back against the wooden door, both hands hanging at his sides. Elias didn't step onto the platform. He stood beside the screen at the front of the room and said that before they discussed the transfer, there were a few things everyone ought to see. The screen lit up. The first image was a close photograph of the small glass vial with its rubber stopper, resting against a white background, accompanied by a forensic report from a private laboratory confirming fingerprints recovered from both the body of the vial and the stopper, along with a comparison to a reference sample taken from a cup in the financial director's office. Marguerite didn't move. The second item was the analysis of the liquid remaining in the glass from this very dining room, from the same day, at the same hour, in the same room where they were all now sitting. The third was sound. Elias pressed play, and through the speakers came the noises of a basement at night. Pages turning. Then a woman's voice quietly reading voucher numbers and dates. Then footsteps on a concrete floor. Then the sound of fingers moving along the spines of file boxes. Then the sound of a folder being pulled from a shelf. No one in the room said a word. The fourth item was a money transfer record, showing a payment renamed from an old settlement into a medical assistance fund, together with the approval signature. The fifth was 3 short messages sent to Cormac Santoro's phone, displayed word for word on the screen with their dates and times. And the final item was a photograph of an ordinary sheet of white paper, folded into quarters, bearing a single handwritten line and a signature. Elias said he had found it in his desk drawer on Saturday morning. Marguerite Doyle stared straight ahead and didn't turn her head in either direction. Gideon Falcone remained seated, both hands resting on his thighs, and he smiled. He said it was an elaborate presentation. He said, what did a vial bearing the fingerprints of the person responsible for the supply room prove? That a basement recording contained nothing more than the footsteps of a man looking for a file, that those messages were simply the advice of an uncle to a confused young man. He said that all of it combined wasn't enough for anyone to write even a single line of an indictment, and he said it in that warm, slow voice, smooth as velvet, the voice that had made people feel safe for decades in rooms with high ceilings. Then he said Elias had nothing against him. Elias nodded. He said Gideon was right, and that he had no intention of using any of these things against him. He said he hadn't invited him there to accuse him. He said he had invited him there so he would know who had found him. Then Elias stepped back and looked toward the rear of the room. Adeline rose from the last chair against the wall, where she had been sitting silently from the beginning, and walked forward between the 2 rows of seats. She carried no papers. She stopped in front of Gideon Falcone, close enough that he had to look up at her, and she spoke in an ordinary voice, steady, no louder than necessary. She said that many years ago, in the corridor of the county courthouse, he had stood beside her father and told him that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to let them rest. She said her father had answered him with exactly 1 sentence, and that her father had died before he could say the second. Then she said that today she was standing here, and she would speak slowly so he could hear her clearly. The smile on Gideon Falcone's face didn't disappear. It simply became still, as though it no longer belonged to him. At the front of the room, Rocco stepped aside and opened the door. Nadine Whitlock entered first, followed by 4 federal agents, and one of them carried a stamped document in his hand. 3 days earlier, when Whitlock asked for the original recording instead of a copied version, Adeline had handed over the entire phone. She stood at the evidence intake counter, took it out of its cloth pouch, placed it in the plastic tray, and signed the receipt. The technician asked whether she wanted anything backed up first. She said no. She said they could take everything. She had thought they needed only 1 file, the recording from the basement, and it had never occurred to her that there might be anything else left inside the phone. But their process didn't work 1 file at a time. They copied the entire storage drive, ran it through recovery and noise filtering software, and processed everything in an audio format, including things that had been lying dormant there since before the device had belonged to anyone she knew. On Monday afternoon, just after the door of Emberley Hall closed behind Gideon Falcone and the two agents accompanying him. Nadine Whitlock's phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. She stepped into the hallway to answer it. She listened for a long time, saying nothing beyond a few brief words, then returned to the room and found Adeline among the people rising from their seats to leave. She didn't speak immediately. She asked whether Adeline wanted to step outside. Adeline said she could say it here. Whitlock explained it in the language of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news, slowly, clearly, without adding a single adjective. She said the technical team had processed everything stored on the phone. She said there was an old voicemail file on it, 11 seconds long, saved many years ago. She said that in the background of that recording, behind the woman's voice, there was the voice of a young man speaking on a phone several yards from the microphone. His voice was almost completely buried beneath traffic and wind, something no ordinary phone speaker could ever have made audible. But once the layers were separated and the noise filtered out, it could be heard. Clearly, she said, the voice began to emerge at around the 8th second. Adeline said nothing. She only stood there in the room as it slowly emptied, and inside her head she heard the sound of her own finger pressing stop. The gesture she had repeated again and again through all those years, always stopping at the 7th second, because everything after that was the part she had never been able to bear. Whitlock continued. She said the young man in the recording was arguing with someone about an appointment, his voice loud and hurried, and that in the original case file there was a statement from a man named Ambrose Falcone, supported by an alibi confirmed by 2 witnesses, claiming that at that exact time he had been somewhere far from the scene. She said the technical team was conducting a forensic voice comparison, that it would take time and require procedure, but that she hadn't called Adeline back to talk about procedure. She had called her back so she would know that the case was going to be reopened. Adeline lifted one hand to cover her mouth. She didn't cry immediately. She only stood there while the meaning moved through her slowly, layer by layer, like water soaking through cloth. For all those years, she had filed petitions, had knocked on a door, welded shut, had written the same request over and over, until she knew every line by heart. For all those years she had worked, had slept in her car through 2 winters, had stood in cold hallways telling herself that perhaps no one left in this world remembered her mother anymore, and through every one of those years, the thing that could have changed everything had been sitting in her coat pocket. It had been inside the phone with the scratched screen and the back casing held together with clear tape, the device she carried every day, the one she pulled out whenever she found herself somewhere no one could see her. It had been only 1 second beyond the place where she always stopped, and she would never have found it, would have carried it with her for the rest of her life without knowing. If that Thursday afternoon she had chosen silence, had walked out of the changing room and gone on pouring water for the other tables, had allowed a stranger whose name she didn't even know to finish his glass. She had risked everything to save a man she didn't know, and that, not any petition she had ever filed, was what brought her mother back. The confirmatory test results came back on Wednesday morning. Elias's sample contained traces of the compound, but the concentration was far lower than the level that could have been produced by someone deliberately putting it into his own body, so low that the number itself became a kind of testimony. Considered alongside the vial-bearing fingerprints, the analysis of the liquid from the glass, and the trainee server's statement identifying who had given him the vial and told him to throw it away, the review board concluded that Elias had been given the controlled substance without his knowledge. His lawyer spent 2 straight days working with the prosecutor's office, and came back with an agreement that anyone in Elias's position would have signed immediately. Everything he had voluntarily turned over during the previous 2 years would be treated as an extraordinary mitigating factor. The recommendation was probation, no supervision, no restrictions on travel. The lawyer placed the paper in front of him and said all it needed was 1 signature. Elias didn't pick up the pen. He read the entire document, pushed it back across the table, and said he wanted a different one. He asked for a sentence with real supervision, a real term, someone who would come to check on him, and an obligation to report in person. The lawyer asked whether he understood what he was refusing. Elias said yes. On the day he appeared in court, when he was asked why he was rejecting the agreement, Elias stood and spoke very briefly. He said there was a woman in that courtroom who had lost her mother because a man had bought his freedom with phone calls and a check. He said that if he could now buy his own freedom with the things he had in his hands, then this court had never truly existed, and everyone sitting there was only reenacting a play whose ending had been written in advance. He said he had spent years sitting in a chair cushioned by that story without knowing it, and he had no intention of getting out of that chair the same way. Then he sat down. Many months later, the port system on the south side of the city no longer carried the name of any family. It was restructured into a legally operated business, independently audited every year, and a portion of its shares was distributed to the people who actually worked there, calculated according to the number of years each person had given to the docks. Adeline took charge of the Integrity Division, a title no one understood at first, until the city's first anonymous reporting system for the port industry began operating, and people finally understood what it meant. The announcement meeting was held outside in the yard, where the wind kept flipping the papers on the podium. Hollis Brenner, the oldest dock worker still employed there, stood and said a few words. He said he had worked the same shifts as her father for many years. He said no one in the office building had ever known that man's name, not one of them, but out here in the yard, her father had known everyone's name, knew whose wife was sick, whose child had an exam coming up, who had come to work that morning without eating breakfast. When he finished, he sat down, and no one applauded right away. It took a moment before the applause began. That spring, Nell was discharged from the hospital. She recovered well, and one weekend afternoon, on the patch of grass behind the new place the two sisters had rented, she ran from one end to the other trying to launch a handmade paper kite, running and then turning to look over her shoulder to see whether it had risen yet, laughing so loudly that it could be heard from the kitchen. Elias came by that day carrying a small box. Inside was a tarnished steel pocket watch, with a thin crack running across one corner of the glass. The watch her father had taken to a pawn shop on Archer Street during the final winter of his life, and had never been able to reclaim. Elias said it had taken him only one afternoon to find it, and that he should have looked sooner. Then he said that for more than a year, she had brought coffee into his office every morning, and he had never once asked her name, and he was sorry for that. Adeline held the watch in her hand, turned it over once, then looked up and told him that he had asked. She said he had asked that morning when he called her into his office, and that perhaps it had been the first time in many years that someone had asked her that question and truly wanted to hear the answer. The two of them stood there, watching the little girl run across the grass, saying nothing more, while the wind came in from the lake, carrying the cold scent of water from a spring that had only just begun. This story leaves behind something very simple. Real power doesn't belong to the person sitting in the middle of the room with all the money and influence in his hands. It belongs to the person who dares to step forward and speak the truth at the right moment, even if that person is wearing nothing more than a uniform and a pair of shoes worn thin at the heels. Kindness is never wasted, even when we believe we have sacrificed everything and saved nothing, because some of the good we plant today will find its way back to us, along a road we could never have imagined. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: that the people we pass every day, the person who pours our coffee, the person who cleans the floor, the person who unloads cargo at the docks, each one carries an entire life within them, and the very least we can do for one another is ask each other's names and remember them. If today's story touched your heart, please press like and share it so more people can hear it, and subscribe to our channel so meaningful stories like this can accompany you every day. How do you feel about Adeline's choice? And if you were in her place, would you have dared to whisper those 7 words? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace in every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.